to talk about what happened with Simi from an immigration lawyer's point of view. When I was looking at watching the movie, and we saw where his family came from, you know, it's not a matter of blaming the parents for putting the pressure on him per se. I think the pressure for him is inherent, right? He comes from a family from the countryside who struggle to make it to the city, who struggle to have their only son come to Canada. Most of us in Canada, if we had to have our kids, if we had to pay the international student fees for our kids, wouldn't be able to afford it. No less someone who is, from outside of the country. So this is inherent for a child who knows the sacrifices that their parents have, right? To have to come to Canada and the sacrifices to pay. And so the pressures to succeed is there. He's an only child. His family has sacrificed so much. And I think, that is extraordinarily amount of pressure for him. And added to that, the immigration system is very difficult for most people to immigrate. I hear it all the time from people. I was so hard for me to immigrate before. Now it's so easy. Everybody has it so easy. That is absolutely not true. In fact, the opposite is true. The immigration system gets harder and harder and harder for people to immigrate. And it is absolutely not easy for even international students who do have certain paths open to them. It's not necessarily easy for someone to immigrate. So first of all, right now, when he was immigrating, the system was at a certain level. Right now, it's even more difficult. And I just kind of wanted to highlight how difficult it is for someone to immigrate right now under economic categories. First of all, you need to find a high-skilled job. You can't just find any job, okay? What's a high-skilled job? Well, you have to be a supervisor, for example, at a restaurant, or you have to have some like a technical job, etc. Not everything is high-skilled. You have to work at least for 1 year in Canada, okay? As an employee, you can't be self-employed, okay? The scores that you have to have in English or French are very, very high on the exams. It's not good enough that you say, well, my first language is English, or I've studied in English. Of course I should pass. No. I've had many people whose only language and first language is English or French who couldn't get the scores that we needed. Okay? So, this is for someone if English is their second language, it's much more difficult. And especially I find that people who are from Asian countries, it's known that the language structures between Asian countries and English are so very different that it's much more difficult for someone from Asian countries to score the level that is needed in English as well. Even if you had everything, even if you qualified technically, it doesn't mean that you can actually apply. Right now, most systems will require you to compete with other people. So you not only have to have worked for a year and had a high-skilled job, not only have to score very high English, oftentimes you need 2 degrees because 1 degree isn't good enough. You need to have high-skilled work experience outside of Canada, probably around 3 years. You need to also be young. Once you get to your 30th birthday, it's no longer happy birthdays. You're going to, every year that you are older, by the time you're 30, your points drop by 5 or 6 points. By the time you're in your 40s, it drops fast slide, -10, -11. By the time you're 45, the good news is your points don't drop anymore because of age, but the bad news is that you have a big fat 0 for your age compared to someone in their 20s who has 110 points to someone who's in their 45 to be 0, right? So oftentimes right now, in order to apply for permanent residence under economic categories, you really need to be superstars. And finally, you can also do everything that you should do, and something can still go wrong. You can have missed certain documents. You may have worked maybe when you're not supposed to be working and been out of status. And a lot of people don't even know that they weren't supposed to be working when they were working. Something, you could have done everything right, and oftentimes things still go wrong. The reason why I like to talk about this is because I want to dispel this myth that it is so easy for people to immigrate. And a spousal sponsorship can be one of the most pressurized situations that someone can encounter when going through the immigration system. Because it's not, if I had a client come to me who can be sponsored by a spouse or can go through an economic category, I would normally just tell them to go through the economic category. Because economic category, you're just dependent on yourself. You look at your background, you look at your language, etc. You go by yourself. But when you apply under spousal sponsorship, it is all about the relationship. Okay? If your relationship breaks down before you get permanent residence, and sometimes permanent residence can take 1 year, but oftentimes it can take a lot longer than 1 year. Okay? If your relationship breaks down at any time before you get your permanent residence, then your application fails. And so because of that, the power dynamic between the couple can be very, very different from a normal relationship, right? I often see a lot of times one spouse, the person who's sponsoring that person, holding this power. You can see that there is inevitable that there is a power dynamic when one person is dependent on the other person and dependent on the relationship being there in order to get permanent residence. I think this pressure of the immigration system is so abnormal that I think it may be a contributing factor when we're talking about mental illness as well. Okay, so Simin, he finally, after all of this pressure, okay, he finally gets permanent residence after many years. Then I think there was probably an incident where he was charged with assault or something minor. Maybe it's probably because of his mental illness that this happened. Okay? Now, the immigration system treats someone who has had a criminal conviction as someone who should receive one of the harshest punishments I think there is out there, and I say that is of banishment. Banishment, if you read fairy tales, if you read, legends and fairy tales, you will often hear of a prince was banished. He could choose between between death or banishment, and in the end, he chose banishment, which is second to death. Okay, what is banishment? Banishment means that you are said you need to leave your home. You can never come back. You need to go away and leave your home. And this is essentially what the immigration system does to people who have had a criminal conviction in Canada. Even if you're a permanent resident, even if you've been in Canada since you were a child, you've been in Canada for many, many years, you don't have a home anywhere else. If you have a criminal conviction, then you could receive a double punishment. I think Samin, he had pled guilty to this because his criminal lawyer, who probably didn't understand immigration lawyer, told him, just plead guilty and you'll only get a very light sentence. But not only did he get that sentence that he got under the criminal conviction, I think it was probably maybe 1 day in jail, he got one of the harshest punishments because the immigration system double punishes you. So he got one of the harshest punishments of banishment. What happens is that the immigration system doesn't necessarily just look at what you actually got, what your sentence was. It looks at the crime that you were convicted of. So, for example, assault. If it was assault with a weapon, who knows what the weapon is? I had a client who was charged with assault because he had a butter knife. He was trying to open a door with a butter knife, and they said, "Hey, you're trying to assault me." Okay, so even if whatever it was, if it's assault with a weapon, it carries with it a punishment of up to 10 years. Now, Simin probably had something that was very, very light. He only had 1 day, but the law treats him the same as if there was someone who was, because of the charge that he was convicted of assault with a weapon, it's as if he was handed the harshest sentence when they determine whether or not he is inadmissible or not. Oftentimes, the criminal lawyers, when they don't understand immigration law, they don't understand the double punishment, the punishment of the immigration consequences. And so the criminal lawyer probably shouldn't have advised his client to just plead guilty to something, right? He could have negotiated with a crown probably for a peace bond, where it's not a conviction, or for treatment, or just he could say, no, I'm not guilty because of insanity or something. But because he thought, oh, don't worry, it's just 1 day, who cares, that's all you get, he didn't understand the immigration law, which led to such a harsh punishment. But he could have been able to appeal his removal. He was found to be inadmissible. Okay, means that he would have lost his permanent residence. But he may have been able at that time to appeal to the Immigration Appeal Division to allow him to stay. So, but the situation when he actually was speaking to the officer who was going to give him the admissibility hearing, according to the transcripts, he told the officer that he had a mental illness. And for someone who's suffering from a mental illness, if they are at the level where they cannot provide proper instructions to legal counsel, often schizophrenic patients, we can say they don't understand reality enough to properly provide instructions to a lawyer, they are supposed to be designated a representative who can then properly instruct a lawyer to represent him. But I don't think at any step of the process this was done, because it's up to the board, it's up to the officer who is determining this, and it's up to the Immigration Appeal Board to determine this as well. And I think there was a failure on that part. What the parents were trying to do was they were trying to file a judicial review of the procedure that he underwent with the federal court. And there were a couple of issues. When I was watching the film, I was like, oh, I don't think this is going to work. Okay, and the reason why, there's a couple of things there. First of all, I think they lost because they couldn't get the extension of time. So there's a 15-day window when someone can judicially review the case, right? And the decision. So the decision, when they came, the decision was long past, and they had asked for the court to extend the time, and I think the court refused to extend the time for that. But I think beyond that, it was the question, the issue of mootness that really, I think, would have been on the judge's mind. What is mootness? Mootness is when an issue goes before the court that the court says, well, we can't really do much at this point. It's irrelevant to our proceedings because the remedy, the solution is not there, right? So normally when you do a judicial review of a procedure, of a decision that an officer has made, what happens is the federal court, they don't substitute their own decision. They say, well, procedural fairness was not met. You should go back to another officer to make the decision again. That's what a judicial review is about. But in this case, what is the remedy? Simi is no longer available. Normally the remedy would be go to another officer who can make a decision, and then in the end, if the officer, makes the right decision, that person can stay. That person is no longer issued a removal order. But in this case, there was no removal order anymore to be issued because he was no longer in this world. So I think that was a big issue in going through this procedure. So what can we do today? When I was looking at this film, my thought was the parents don't necessarily need money. The parents want answers. They want accountability. They want possibly to change the system so that other people who are in the situation of their son don't have to suffer the same way that their son suffered, right? That is, I think, the justice that they wanted. And the judicial review, the federal, I don't think that was the venue for that. Instead, what we can do is ask for a public inquiry. What a public inquiry does is it looks at for the best interest of the public, to look at the system as to what went wrong and how the system can change, right? And I think that is what we should be calling for. Cases like Simi, and I'm sure there are many other cases, right? How did these things go wrong, and how can we resolve it for the future? We should also look at double punishing permanent residents. When someone has made Canada their home, then if they commit, criminal convictions, especially for something that is very, very minor, they should not be banished and double punished as well, right? They will serve their time in the criminal system, but they should not suffer. And the law since Simi has changed to be even harsher right now. Like for example, if any of you are convicted of drinking and driving, okay, you could very well be out of the country. If you are convicted of drinking and driving outside of Canada, it's automatic. You don't even get to tell your story and ask for an appeal. If it's inside the country, you may be able to appeal, but you could be banished from the country. Okay, so I think we really people need to understand how this affects people to a degree that is unjust, unfair. And I think the third thing is counseling. There is so much pressure on students, on workers, on people who are going through the immigration system that can take years to process. And this is a system that affects people to the core. This is one of the most important things that they will do for themselves and for their families. And the stress is abnormal. And it will affect people's mental illness. Even the strongest, people, it can affect people's mental illness tremendously. And I think we need to certainly take a look at that.